Lucius Vibullius Rufus, Pompey's Majordomo, 49 to 48 BCE. An expert in military engineering, Lucius Vibullius Rufus was a low-ranking member of the Senate. Yet this scion of an obscure plebeian gens wielded a great deal of influence due to his close association with Pompey the Great. We can only presume that Vibullius gained the trust of the former boy butcher during one of his legendary campaigns during the 70s or 60s, or when Pompey was trying to manage the city of Rome during the 50s as the most public face of the first triumvirate. By the time Caesar crossed the Rubicon, Pompey had come to regard Vibullius as almost an extension of himself and sent him on a number of dangerous missions, where Vibullius would find himself in the rather uncomfortable position of issuing orders to men who had previously held the Republic's highest offices. Caesar made an exception to his one-pardon policy for the sake of Vibullius, as he was caught twice in 49 and then sent on an errand as an envoy for Caesar in 48. Despite being beyond the point of receiving more of Caesar's clemency, Vibullius next went to Italy to coordinate a failed AstroTurf revolt of debtors and slaves, during the course of which he almost certainly lost his life. Vibullius's life, or at least the year and a half or so that we know about, saw him leading a fast and furious existence in the service of his political master, Pompey the Great. Gens Vibullia was a rather obscure plebeian gens. It had been in Roman politics since the early 3rd century, and yet it still was not all that well established, and to the best of our knowledge, it also had not produced any consuls by that point. This family hailed from the Oscan-speaking south-central part of Italy, so the part of Italy in the south that was not along the coast or had not been settled by the Greeks. The first attested member of the gens was Decimus Vibullius, who was a military tribune in 282 BCE, and he commanded the garrison at Thurii until the consul for that year was able to break through and aid him against the Samnites and their various allies. As for our Vibullius, he is the founder of the family's most famous branch, the Rufus or Red branch, and usually that name would come from having a member who has red hair, but it could come from other reasons as well, but usually it is someone having red hair that creates the branch name Rufus. In terms of how he became this prominent, this is of course due to his aforementioned closeness with Pompey, and that's something we're going to expand upon later. In terms of how he came to be close with Pompey, there's a very good chance that, given his background as a military engineer, he served in Pompey's armies, and perhaps he even was sponsored as a new senator by Pompey. And he also might have picked up the wealth he needed to qualify for membership through plunder on the various campaigns Pompey had, especially the really profitable ones out east against Mithridates, where a lot of men became quite wealthy serving under Pompey. Now, usually I save descendants until the end, but it is worth noting that while a number of men called Vibullius Rufus will do pretty well for themselves in the early empire, by far the most famous man to bear the name Vibullius going forward will be someone who is known mostly as Atticus Herodes, but his technical full name is Lucius Vibullius Hipparchus Tiberius Claudius Atticus Herodes. And he will become consul in 143 CE. He was actually born in Athens and became a citizen. That means he was sponsored by someone from the Vibullius family. Most likely this was one of the various distant cousins of our Vibullius Rufus. That being said, this is still the most famous person to be associated with the family in some way. And by adoption, I suppose you could say, or by sponsorship, the family was able to attain a very high level of cultural achievement, because Atticus Herodes became one of the great orators of the 2nd century, when oratory had a kind of second golden age during the so-called Second Sophistic. And so Vibullius ultimately helped to keep his family relevant enough to get to that point where Atticus Herodes could become consul and keep that name alive for a little longer and even immortalize it a bit. As we mentioned earlier, Vibullius had a fair amount of military experience. We know, for instance, that at one point he served as the praefectus fabrum, or military engineer. Most likely this was under Pompey directly in an earlier campaign, and so this would explain why Pompey takes Vibullius seriously as a military figure, and why he will now entrust him with a number of missions that by rights should have gone to much more experienced in terms of their office holding men. During the 49 campaign, where Caesar would cross the Rubicon with a small force and invade Italy, Pompey was at first confident that he could call up enough men to repulse the invasion, but then he kind of panicked when he realized that Caesar had a large number of legions ready to go, and so of course he expected that Caesar would invade full force. Some of his commanders who went out to raise men were not terribly lucky or frankly very good. One of them was Publius Cornelius Lentulus Spenther, who had been consul back in 57. He was actually raising troops in the area of Picenum, where the Pompey family hailed from. And yet, despite the fact that this was Pompey country, when Caesar's men showed up to the area, Lentulus Spenther's army started to wither away as men deserted and went over to Caesar. And so this sent shockwaves in Pompey's command tent. And this is partly why Vibullius went to take command from Lentulus Spenther. Perhaps Pompey thought that Lentulus Spenther might be incompetent. As I mentioned in a previous video, the Lentuli were not terribly well regarded by many of their peers. Many of their peers found them to be kind of pretentious guys who often coasted on their pedigrees, at least in this particular period. And so Vibullius took over those men, possibly after some griping from the previous commander, and gathered up some other disparate Pompeian levies that were being raised up. And this gave him a total of 13 cohorts once he absorbed the 6 cohorts that were under Lucius Hyrus. So this was about a legion and a half or so. And with these men, he now marched to the city of Corfinium, where the former consul of 54, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, was stationed. And so, Vibullius, given his connections with Pompey, had every expectation that Pompey's orders through him would be obeyed, but that was about to be put to the test for the first time. One of the things that precipitated Caesar crossing the Rubicon in the first place was that the consul Lentulus Crus had actually asked Pompey to take up the sword on behalf of the Senate and people of Rome against Caesar, who they declared to be an outlaw. Yet that authority that Pompey now had was not very tightly defined, and while he clearly was in charge, that seems to have been a somewhat unofficial thing. It was not something that was super clearly defined. And we have to remember that a lot of the senior men who rose up to be sub-commanders, while they sided with Pompey against Caesar, they had until recently largely been hostile to Pompey. So during the time of the First Triumvirate, a number of these men had not necessarily been friends with Pompey. And so they did not see themselves as being all that closely aligned with him. They also often saw themselves as rivals. And so Domitius Ahenobarbus, being a former consul, did not see the need to follow orders unflinchingly when issued by a man that he probably didn't respect all that much in Pompey. When Vibullius arrives with his troops, Domitius was not very grateful to see him, and he refused to merge those two forces together. Pompey's orders were to retreat to Luceria, where he was massing the army. And so Domitius insisted upon sticking at Corfinium, where he thought that he could be sort of a speed bump as Caesar comes south. Yet, that is not how things played out, as we'll talk about in a little while. Pompey was of the opinion that they should go to Luceria in preparation to leave for Greece, and his reason for thinking that was very simply because he didn't think the legions were trustworthy. He had already seen what had happened up north with the previous army commanded by Vibullius's predecessor. And so, not only was Vibullius trying to argue with Domitius in person, but Domitius and Pompey were sending letters back and forth. There is, I think, a fine piece of speculation by Robin Seeger, who wrote a biography of Pompey back in 1979, and his speculation is that Domitius Ahenobarbus was actually trying to force Pompey to change his policy. He thinks that Vibullius was already aware that Pompey planned to abandon Italy altogether, and that he shared this orally with Domitius, and that although Domitius never put that in his letters, that he was aware of this, and this was his way of protesting by creating a crisis around Corfinium that would force Pompey to commit early. That being said, partly all of this was based on Pompey not knowing how few men Caesar had actually started the invasion with. But then, even after he realized his mistake, he kind of said, well, but Caesar does have those men ready to go, and there's no way he's going to hold them back forever, so they're going to be coming soon. We still need to abandon Italy. Had I to do it over, I might do things differently, but that's not the world we live in. And it would turn out that while Domitius maybe had a valid reason for trying to slow down Pompey and keep the fight in Italy, it ended up being a terrible decision because once Caesar did approach, Domitius had not much better luck than his predecessor had had farther north. And so the army under Domitius was largely wiped out, by which I mean it largely deserted. And now Vibullius, who is helping Domitius despite their disagreements, will be captured for the first time. But soon thereafter he'll be released, and he will go back to Pompey for more instructions, and very soon after that he will be on his way to Spain. In his commentaries, Caesar said that once Pompey was out of Italy, he had to choose between whether to go after the general without an army, i.e. Pompey in Greece, or to go after the army without a general, i.e. the 7 legions that Pompey had in Spain. And Caesar ultimately opted to go for Spain first in 49. Now, it is worth noting that the jibe that he made for a nice soundbite, but it's probably unfair to the men who actually were in command in Spain. These were all men who had served under Pompey for years, and they had done quite well, at least when under his command. Lucius Afranius was a former consul. Marcus Petrius was a former praetor who also had the distinction of defeating Catiline on the battlefield. And Marcus Terentius Varro, while probably not the best soldier, was a respected senator and a man of learning. And so these were all very capable, distinguished men. These were not just scrubs, as Caesar would have you believe. That being said, given how quickly the campaign was resolved, I can kind of get why Caesar was in a mood to talk some trash about their abilities after the campaign had concluded. Of the 7 legions in Spain, though, their loyalty was a bit suspect, because although a number of them had been raised by Pompey at one point, some of them had served with Caesar in Gaul, and so some of them felt a little bit more loyalty to him than they did to Pompey. So the situation was a bit fraught to start with, and Vibullius would come in to try to serve as almost commander-in-chief by proxy. Now, he did not outrank Afranius or Petrius, and most likely had friendly relations with both, since they were all dedicated Pompeians, in both the current sense of fighting for Pompey against Caesar, and in the long-term sense of being guys who owed everything to Pompey's patronage. And so most likely nobody was really giving that many orders. These guys are all friends and have fought alongside each other for decades. But Pompey's instructions were for Petrius to take his 2 legions up, reinforce Lucius Afranius, and their 5 legions plus most of the auxiliaries would hold the line in nearer Spain. Meanwhile, Varro would stay back in farther Spain with his 2 legions to keep the peace there. It wasn't necessarily a bad strategy, but again, a number of these men preferred Caesar, and Caesar was a much better general than Lucius Afranius, who now took supreme command, or the closest equivalent thereof. The campaign was arguably one of Caesar's best. He concluded it very quickly, acquired several new legions, some of which he disbanded, and then he left his governors there and went back to organize his invasion of Greece for 48. And among the other people who were taken prisoner was none other than our good friend Lucius Vibullius Rufus. It's worth noting that typically Caesar only pardoned someone once, and if he then released them afterwards and caught them again, it would be a death sentence. But it's possible that he either made a straight-up exception for Vibullius, or that at the time that he had captured him, he didn't have a policy yet, because it was so early in the war. It's not quite clear when he did start to do the kind of one pardon policy. But at any rate, Vibullius would not fall prey to the negative consequences of fighting Caesar twice. If Caesar indeed did make an exception to his one pardon policy in Vibullius's favor, then one compelling reason for why he might have done that is because he wanted to make a peace offering to Pompey. And so Caesar kept Vibullius close to him to try to establish some kind of rapport between the two of them. And then Vibullius accompanied Caesar during the first wave of the invasion of Greece in 48. After they landed, Caesar gave Vibullius a horse and told him to go to Pompey and deliver a message. He knew that Vibullius was trusted by Pompey, and he also figured that Vibullius would be grateful to him for this favor and would represent his case eloquently and honestly. The argument that Caesar advanced was that both Pompey and Caesar had sustained victory and defeat in equal measure. They were about equally matched at this point, and fortune could swing either way. In either case, it would be a bit of a tragedy because both of these men had done great things for the Republic. Both of them could continue to do great things in the future, and the people and Senate should not have to suffer as this conflict drags on. In fact, why don't they both simply go back to Italy and allow the Senate to resolve this dispute and come up with a peaceable solution and let the war end? Arthur Kahn, who wrote The Education of Julius Caesar back in 1986, which is, in my opinion, still the best book on Caesar to this day, says that one of Caesar's failings was that while he very much was amenable to reasoned discourse, that he sometimes overestimated how much other people were open to such things. And so he often overestimated how reasonable and rational his political opponents were. And he often was shocked when they would refuse his offers. And I think that this might be the case here for reasons we'll get into in just a minute. To build on the point that we were just discussing about how Caesar often overestimated how rational his opponents were, he has often been accused of being a rather poor judge of character. That being said, I think that he had Vibullius pegged pretty accurately. He knew that Vibullius was a man of his word. And so he knew that even though Vibullius was still loyal to Pompey, he would do as Caesar requested because he was grateful for being spared twice. Caesar was probably aware, as Vibullius rode at a camp full tilt, that Vibullius's motive for riding so hard was simply because he wanted to make sure Pompey knew that Caesar had landed and where he was at. Apparently Caesar was confident enough in either his military ability or in the power of the message he was sending with Vibullius that he was okay with Pompey learning about his whereabouts earlier. Vibullius, of course, didn't know exactly where Pompey was when he landed, and so he was riding hell for leather, probably for a few days, having to change out horses and requisition horses along the way, before he was finally able to report in to his political mentor. At this point, Pompey's authority had been more strengthened than it had been before, and so there weren't as many of these consulars acting sort of roguishly as Domitius had done. In fact, Domitius would be one of the more important commanders in the Greek campaign, and this time he would much more conduct himself like a normal legate rather than as an independent operator. This also meant that because Pompey now had full authorization to conduct the war as he pleased, he was the only person who could approve or deny a peace offer from Caesar. So when Vibullius had presumably had a little bit of wine and reported Caesar's position and all that, he now discharged what may well have been a distasteful debt by telling Pompey of Caesar's offer. Pompey apparently cut him off before he had finished the full argument, however, because he said that this was simply not going to happen. And his reason for thinking that there's no way I can make peace at this point is because he said that while Caesar was right that both of them had won and lost in equal measure, and that they were about equal in terms of their chances of winning the war, Pompey actually thought he had a little bit better of a chance than Caesar, and he probably did, by the way, if we look at how Dyrrhachium turned out. But he said that his reason for not being able to accept peace at this time was simply because he had fled from Caesar in Italy. And now if he were to surrender, or at least make peace once Caesar lands and brings the fight to him a second time, then the natural interpretation that most people would have is that he was afraid of Caesar, and that Caesar had actually beaten him and pardoned him, and that to save face they had pretended like they had made peace, but in reality it had been Pompey bowing down to the greatness of Caesar. And Pompey would never do that, because in fact he was greater than Caesar, and he would not, under any circumstances, bow down to someone who was not greater than him. And so Caesar once again was banking on a level of rationality that wasn't present, because Pompey was much more concerned with the appearance of strength and prestige and precedence. Although Vibulus's mission technically failed, it would have some repercussions. There would be more talks going forward about a potential peace settlement. These talks, however, would be short-lived and not really end up amounting to much. Bibulus, the commander of the Pompeian fleet and one of his chief subordinates, Scribonius Libo, agreed to meet with Caesar. However, once the meeting day came, only Scribonius Libo showed up, and Bibulus supposedly didn't show up because people were afraid of his temper, but in reality it's more likely that he didn't show up because he didn't want to have to face Caesar again. After all, the last time he had faced Caesar, Caesar and his tribune Publius Vatinius had been threatening him with violence. Another thing to keep in mind is that Bibulus would actually die within about a month of this event. And so there's a very good chance that he was already on or nearing his deathbed and really didn't feel up to attending. So there's no reason to think that his subordinate was able to keep him out of a meeting. It's more likely that he was either ill or that he simply didn't want to be in the same room as Caesar. At any event, those talks didn't end up going anywhere, and Caesar quickly ascertained that Scribonius Libo merely wanted a ceasefire so that way he could resupply all the ships. So, in order to make these talks a little more serious, and to possibly win over some of the Pompeian troops by appearing to be more reasonable, Caesar then sent one of his reliable men, Publius Vatinius, the aforementioned tribune from back in 59, and Vatinius went up to the men and made a big speech about how peace would be beneficial to all. And he had a lot of interested listeners from both sides of the lines. He was starting to build a lot of resonance there. Actually, someone even promised that they would come over to talk to him the next day. But Titus Labienus, one of the legates in Pompey's army and a former subordinate of Caesar, showed up, and he quite literally rained on that parade. And arrows were fired, a number of men were wounded, especially men on Caesar's side, and Labienus then shouted to Vatinius and others that the only thing that could bring peace was the head of Gaius Julius Caesar. And so ultimately Vibulus's mission failed, but it was made in good faith, at least on Vibulus's part, and possibly even on Caesar's at first. Although I suspect that the later incident with Vatinius was a bit spiteful, as a way to kind of rub it in the Pompeians' face and undermine the loyalty of some of their men. In the spirit of ruthless aggression espoused by Titus Labienus, Pompey also wanted to see Caesar's head on a platter, and he was willing to do anything in order to make that a reality. And in this case, anything included sponsoring a slave revolt, something that we would think would be anathema to his being, given how conservative he had become by this point, and how the Optimates tended to be so class-conscious and so fearful of empowering the masses in any way. But back in Italy, an opportunity had now arisen. Marcus Caelius Rufus, who in many ways sympathized much more with the Optimates than with Caesar, had actually gone with Caesar in 49 on the simple grounds that Caesar would win the civil war. He had more and better troops. Caelius, however, decided to now use his position as praetor, this was his reward for siding with Caesar, in order to stir up trouble. So earlier there had been a debt agreement reached, where Caesar had authorized the relief of 1/3 of all debt. And so that had been pretty popular among people, but Caelius thought that more was needed. And so what he did is he decided to kind of have an alternative offering, where he said that Caesar was cheaping out on them and abandoning the common people. And so Caesar had one official set up who would sign off on debt relief, and then Caelius used his chair as praetor to sit beside that person and give more grandiose offers. And for the most part, he was not attracting that much interest. A little bit of discontent, but not a lot. Yet it was enough to attract the negative attention from the consuls who'd been left behind in Italy, and they began to move on Caelius the way that Cicero had earlier moved against Catiline. In the meantime, Caelius called upon Titus Annius Milo, who had been in exile for a while, and he of course had been one of the famous street gang leaders in the 50s, to fight Clodius. So he comes in and he's going to aid Caelius in the battle to come. Meanwhile, Pompey apparently is keeping abreast of this and may have even been low-key responsible for a lot of it. And what he decides to do is to send someone more seasoned in the form of Vibullius. So Vibullius will now go to Italy to coordinate the efforts of Milo and Caelius. And Vibullius is the one who urged them to go from debtors to slaves and especially gladiators as their base of support. So the debtor strategy was not working super well, and Vibullius told them to shift their focus. So Milo went to Campania, and he started to try to recruit men there from the gladiators and other slaves. And one of the pitches that he would make to people is that he had the auspice of Pompey, by way of Vibullius, who might have been there at these meetings, because Vibullius, by this point, was well known as Pompey's representative. And you might think that this would have some cachet, but it doesn't seem like this excited that much interest. And so, for the most part, not many people showed up for this uprising, and it was swiftly and brutally put down. It was even less successful than Catiline's rising. And we don't know exactly who all died during it, but we do know that Milo and Caelius both died. And so there's an extremely good chance that Vibullius Rufus also died, whether he was executed or whether he died in battle. At any rate, we never hear of him again. And so it is here, in this failed uprising in Italy, that Vibullius met his last. In the final analysis, Lucius Vibullius Rufus was a fixer or majordomo, a kind of political figure that was becoming very common during the late Republic. In fact, a number of the great men in Rome had guys who would serve as kind of their point man, someone who would show up and people would understand that this man represented one of the titans of Roman politics. We see this trend play out with Mark Antony, who had Quintus Dellius, and of course the most famous fixer of all was Gaius Clinius Maecenas, who served this role for Octavian. And most future emperors would have a number of guys who would fulfill this role, many of whom were actually equestrians like Dellius and Maecenas, but some of whom were senators like Vibullius. That being said, he was the least fortunate of this trio, as, again, he was associated with some of the worst and most embarrassing defeats in a losing effort. And so often he is easily overlooked, but it's very clear that he was quite respected in his own time, both by Pompey and even by Pompey's rivals. Caesar clearly had personal respect for Vibullius and for his character. He also must have been giving fairly sound political and military advice if we look at how well Pompey tended to do throughout his career. Especially, Vibullius must have come in handy during the 50s, when Pompey found himself in unfamiliar territory. Pompey was far better at military strategy than he was at politics. And even after a decade or so back in Rome, he really was never that comfortable in the Senate House. He was always a somewhat clumsy, artificial speaker, and he often tended to rely upon verbiage and non-answers. So he was not someone who could really turn a situation to his favor the way that, say, Cicero or Caesar, or even someone like Cato the Younger could. And so Vibullius would have a pretty good understanding of these things and make sure that Pompey was prepared. And of course, he did carry out Pompey's instructions faithfully. It's just that those instructions ultimately did not result in victory. And my suspicion, although I have not quite been able to prove this as of yet, is that men like Vibullius were actually quite common in Rome, and that most of the major Roman politicians had a Vibullius somewhere in their household or in their political retinue. That being said, unless you are the Majordomo of someone like a Pompey, you're not going to show up in the historical record, and that's why most of the men who occupied the same position as Vibullius are unknown to us. And so, just by virtue of name recognition, Vibullius deserves at least some credit and respect. As Jack Sparrow once said in Pirates of the Caribbean when he was arrested, the governor told him that he's the worst pirate he's ever heard of, and Jack Sparrow retorted with, "But you have heard of me." Remember, ladies and gentlemen, you have heard of Lucius Vibullius Rufus. You've also heard of Thersites the historian, so stay tuned, make sure that you're subscribed, and I will see you again very soon.